Podcast Talk.
Learn English naturally.
What people say when they don't feel comfortable.
Most people don't go silent when they feel uncomfortable. They keep talking. They use familiar phrases, soft words, and polite sounds to protect themselves. And if you listen closely, you can hear discomfort hiding inside completely normal English.
What makes this interesting is that these phrases often sound confident. They sound polite. They sound correct. But underneath, they signal hesitation, distance, or a desire to escape the moment.
This happens in meetings, in friendships, and even in casual conversations. People answer questions without really answering them. They respond without revealing how they feel. And most listeners miss it completely.
Understanding these moments changes how you hear English. You stop focusing on vocabulary. You start noticing patterns. And suddenly, conversations make more sense than before.
In this episode, we're not talking about grammar or perfect answers. We're talking about real reactions. The kind people use when they don't feel comfortable but still want to sound normal.
These are the moments where English becomes emotional, where tone matters more than words, and where silence, pauses, and soft phrases carry more meaning than long explanations.
If you've ever answered, yeah, sure, while feeling unsure or said it's fine when it wasn't, then you already know this language. You've just never had words for it.
Listening for discomfort helps you understand people better. Not just what they say, but what they avoid, and why certain conversations feel tense without obvious reasons.
If you enjoy real conversations and want to understand English on this level, make sure to stay with us. Episodes like this help you hear what most learners miss.
Because once you start hearing discomfort, English stops sounding confusing, starts sounding human.
One of the first signs of discomfort is when people choose safe language. They don't say what they think, they say what sounds acceptable. Words become shields. And the conversation slowly moves away from honesty without anyone noticing it happening.
You can hear this when answers feel slightly delayed, not silent, but careful. People pause, adjust, and soften their response before speaking. Those small adjustments often reveal more than the words themselves.
Another common reaction is over politeness. Extra kindness, extra agreement. It sounds positive, but it often hides discomfort or the need to avoid conflict.
This is why some conversations feel pleasant but empty. Nothing is wrong. Nothing is said directly, and yet something important never appears.
People also use short answers when they feel uncomfortable, like not because they are uninterested, but because short answers reduce exposure. They give less space for follow-up questions.
Phrases like, yeah, I guess, or maybe often appear here. They sound neutral, they keep things moving, but they also prevent depth from forming.
Discomfort also changes how people ask questions. They avoid open questions. They choose safer ones. Questions that don't invite honesty but limit it.
When questions feel safe, conversations start to feel controlled. And you can hear it in the way people respond, because they stop exploring and they start managing. Like they're trying to protect the mood rather than share the truth. So instead of answering openly, they choose smaller answers that cannot create follow-up. And this happens all the time at work when someone asks, how's the project going? And the other person says something like, yeah, it's moving along. Because that sounds fine, and it doesn't invite more pressure, but underneath it can mean I'm worried, or I'm behind, or it's like, or I don't want to explain. And the uncomfortable part is that nobody says the real thing directly. And the conversation stays smooth, but afterward it feels empty because nothing actually landed.
And the tricky part is that discomfort doesn't only show up with strangers, it also shows up with friends, with partners, with people you trust. Because comfort is not just about the person, It's about the moment. So you can be close to someone and still feel uncomfortable when the topic is sensitive, or when you don't want to disappoint them, or when you feel judged. And that's why you'll hear people suddenly switch into softer language like, I don't know, or maybe, or we'll see, because those phrases create distance without sounding cold, and they allow the person to stay polite while quietly stepping back from the conversation.
When you start noticing discomfort in conversations, English begins to sound different. You stop listening only for correct answers. You notice how people hesitate, soften their words, or avoid details. And once you hear those signals, conversations become easier to understand because you're listening not just to language, but to how comfortable a person feels in that moment.
Discomfort often changes the rhythm of speech. People speak a little slower or sometimes a little faster than usual. They repeat simple words or choose very general phrases. These small shifts don't feel dramatic, but together they quietly change the direction of the conversation.
You can also hear discomfort in how people agree. Instead of clear agreement, they use soft responses, things like, yeah, maybe, "Ançılarlar," or is, I think so. These answers sound cooperative, but they keep emotional distance.
This kind of language helps people stay polite without fully engaging. They don't want to disagree, they don't want to explain. So they choose words that keep the conversation light, even if it feels incomplete.
Another sign of discomfort is changing the focus. Instead of answering directly, people talk around the topic. They add extra details that aren't necessary. And slowly, the original question disappears.
This doesn't mean people are dishonest. Most of the time, they are protecting themselves. They want to stay safe inside the conversation. Language becomes a way to manage emotions, not just share information.
This is exactly why understanding discomfort matters so much in real conversations. Nothing sounds wrong on the surface. People are polite, responsive, and calm. But something feels unfinished because the conversation stays on a safe level and never reaches anything personal or meaningful.
Many learners think these moments mean they did something wrong, but very often it has nothing to do with mistakes. It has to do with emotional distance. People choose language that protects them instead of language that connects.
You can hear this distance in very simple answers. Not silence, but minimal responses. They keep the conversation moving without inviting depth. They sound fine, but they quietly close the door to further discussion.
Discomfort also changes how long people stay with the topic. They answer, then quickly move on. They don't pause, they don't expand, because staying too long feels risky when emotions are involved.
Once you start noticing these patterns, conversations stop feeling confusing. You understand why some exchanges stay shallow. And you stop blaming your English because you realize the issue isn't language, it's comfort.
One of the hardest things about discomfort is that it often sounds normal. People don't suddenly change their voice or vocabulary. They keep using everyday English, but the intention shifts. Instead of sharing, they manage the moment, choosing words that keep things calm, light, and emotionally distant. So nothing escalates and nothing truly connects.
This is why discomfort is so easy to miss. There are no obvious mistakes. Everything sounds polite and correct. But the conversation stays on the surface because people are speaking to avoid tension rather than to express what they actually feel in that moment.
You can hear this especially clearly when topics become personal. People shorten their answers, they generalize, they move from specifics to vague language. Because details feel risky when someone doesn't feel fully safe inside the conversation.
In these moments, English becomes protective, not expressive. Words are chosen to close doors softly instead of opening them. And even though nothing sounds negative, the conversation slowly loses depth and direction.
Many learners feel confused here because they sense the distance but don't know why. They think they should speak better or faster. But the issue isn't fluency. It's that the other person is emotionally stepping back while still talking.
This emotional step back often shows up through neutral language, nothing strong, nothing specific. Just enough words to keep the conversation polite and moving without revealing anything that feels too personal or vulnerable.
And the longer this continues, the more invisible the discomfort becomes. Both people stay engaged on the surface, oh, but underneath, neither feels fully present. The conversation exists, but connection does not.
This is why some conversations feel tiring without being difficult. You're listening, you're responding, but something never settles because emotional safety was never established.
Once you recognize this pattern, you stop forcing yourself to fix the conversation. You stop blaming your English. Instead, you start reading the emotional level of the exchange, and that changes how you participate.
Because real communication isn't about saying more, it's about sensing when someone is pulling back. And knowing that sometimes the most natural response is to slow down rather than push forward.
What makes discomfort difficult to hear is that it hides inside very normal sounding English because people don't suddenly become quiet or rude. They stay polite and responsive. They keep saying things that sound correct and appropriate, but the intention underneath changes. So instead of using language to connect or explain, they use it to maintain control over the situation, choosing words that keep the moment calm, predictable, and emotionally safe, even if that safety comes at the cost of honesty or depth.
You can hear this shift when people start answering in ways that sound finished even though the topic isn't, because their responses don't invite continuation, they don't leave space for curiosity or follow-up, and instead they gently close the subject, which often happens when someone feels pressure, uncertainty, or emotional risk. So they choose language that allows them to exit the moment without conflict or explanation.
This is especially common when conversations move toward feelings, opinions, or personal experiences, because these areas require emotional exposure. And when someone doesn't feel fully comfortable, they naturally pull back, using more general language, fewer details, and shorter explanations, not because they have nothing to say, but because saying more feels unsafe in that moment.
What confuses many learners is that none of this sounds negative, because the words themselves are neutral or even friendly, but the emotional direction of the conversation changes. And instead of moving forward into something shared or meaningful, it stays carefully balanced, polite, and distant, which can feel frustrating when you don't understand why the connection never fully forms.
Once you understand that discomfort shapes language this way, you stop trying to push conversations forward with more words, and instead, you start paying attention to emotional signals, timing, and tone, because real communication doesn't depend on saying the perfect thing. It depends on sensing whether the moment is open or closed and responding accordingly.
Another clear sign of discomfort is when people begin to sound reasonable instead of honest, because being reasonable feels safer. It sounds mature and controlled, and it allows someone to stay emotionally protected. So instead of saying what they really think or feel, they explain why something makes sense, why it's understandable, or why it's not a big deal. And this kind of language often appears in situations where someone doesn't want to disagree openly or doesn't want to reveal inner tension.
This reasonable tone often hides emotional avoidance because it shifts the conversation away from personal experience and toward neutral explanations. And while that can keep things calm on the surface, it also prevents deeper connection. Since emotions are replaced by logic and feelings are translated into safe, distant language that doesn't invite response.
You can also hear discomfort when people start framing their answers in general terms, using phrases like people usually or in general, because speaking in generalities allows them to step away from responsibility and emotion, making the conversation less personal and therefore less risky, even though the original question may have been very specific.
These shifts in language are rarely conscious because most people don't decide to hide discomfort, they simply react to it. And language adjusts automatically, choosing safer paths, softer expressions, and less exposure, which is why discomfort in conversation often feels invisible unless you know how to listen for it.
Once you begin hearing these patterns clearly, conversations stop feeling random or confusing because you understand that what sounds like hesitation, politeness, or vagueness often has emotional meaning. And this awareness allows you to respond with more sensitivity instead of pushing for clarity at the wrong moment.
Discomfort also changes how people react to agreement because instead of fully joining the other person's idea, they soften their support, using language that sounds cooperative but stays emotionally cautious. And this often happens when someone doesn't want to create expectations, commit too strongly, or be pulled deeper into a topic that feels uncertain or sensitive at that moment.
You can hear this in phrases that acknowledge without committing because they recognize the other person's point but stop short of fully agreeing, which allows the conversation to stay polite and smooth while quietly limiting how far it can go, especially in situations where emotional alignment feels risky or unclear.
Another place where discomfort becomes visible is humor, because people often use jokes to soften tension or redirect attention. And while humor can create relief, it can also signal avoidance, especially when it appears right after a serious question or an emotionally loaded moment.
When humor appears at the wrong moment, it changes the direction of the conversation because instead of staying with the feeling, people move away from it, and the topic becomes lighter, safer, and easier to handle, even though something important was just about to be explored.
This doesn't mean humor is wrong, but it often shows where the emotional limit is because people instinctively protect themselves from vulnerability, and language quickly adjusts to keep things manageable rather than meaningful.
Discomfort also affects how people listen, because instead of fully staying with the speaker, they begin preparing an exit, thinking about how to respond, change the topic, or move on. And that internal shift subtly pulls energy out of the conversation.
You can feel this when responses arrive quickly but feel thin because the words are there, but attention is already elsewhere, and the conversation continues in form but not in connection.
For learners, this moment is often confusing because it feels like something went wrong, but nothing obvious happened. And understanding discomfort helps explain why conversations sometimes fade without conflict, disagreement, or clear endings.
Once you recognize how discomfort works, you stop chasing better answers and instead, you start paying attention to timing, pacing, and emotional cues because those elements often matter more than what is actually said.
And this awareness changes how you communicate because you no longer try to push conversations forward. You learn when to pause, when to soften, and when to let a moment pass, which is often what real English sounds like in everyday life.
As conversations move closer to the end, discomfort often becomes quieter rather than louder because people stop trying to manage the moment with words and start relying on tone, pacing, and silence. And this is where many listeners misunderstand what is happening, thinking the conversation is fading, when in reality it is simply settling into a more honest and less guarded space.
This is why silence near the end of a conversation feels different from silence at the beginning. because it no longer signals uncertainty or distance. It signals completion. And when both people feel that nothing more needs to be added, language naturally slows down without feeling awkward or forced.
Understanding discomfort helps you recognize these endings without anxiety because you stop expecting conversations to finish with perfect phrases or clear signals. And instead, you learn to trust the emotional flow, noticing when connection has reached a natural pause rather than assuming something went wrong.
For many learners, this is the moment where English finally feels lighter, because there is no pressure to perform, no need to impress, and no urgency to fill space. And communication becomes less about control and more about shared presence.
If this episode helped you hear English differently and notice what usually stays hidden, make sure to subscribe to Off Script English because this channel is all about real conversations and real language. And we would really love to hear from you in the comments. So tell us what topics you want us to explore next and what situations feel uncomfortable for you because your ideas help shape what we talk about here.